Hi everyone, welcome back to the Tox Lab. I'm Rebecca.
I'm Rob. Today we've got an episode talking about psychedelics, which is going to be quite interesting, hopefully. But before we get into that, why did the mass spectrometrist podcaster buy new microphones?
I don't know.
He wanted to improve his signal-to-noise ratio.
That is appalling as a joke.
I've been working on that literally all week.
No,
and
really?
struggled so hard to come up with a good punchline. But to shoehorn in, we have got mics, which is very exciting. Thank you all, everybody that's provided some feedback so far. We really appreciate it. Do keep giving us more and more feedback.
Yeah, and please feel free to like, comment, follow on our Instagram, which is _tox_lab. Great to hear from you all.
So before we get into the papers, let's talk a bit about psychedelics. So, Rebecca, when we talk about psychedelics, what are we talking about?
So psychedelics are hallucinogenic drugs that primarily alter state of consciousness and cause psychological, visual and auditory changes. So you've got three main families of psychedelics. You've got the tryptamines, the phenethylamines and the lysergamides. And they basically act to stimulate your serotonin 2A receptor, so your 5-HT2A receptors.
So we're talking about here drugs which exclusively are 5-HT2A agonists. We're not talking about drugs that can cause hallucinations by other means. So we're not talking about drugs, for example, like ketamine or MDMA. We're talking purely about these 5-HT2A receptor agonists.
Yeah.
So let's jump into the paper. The paper came out last week. Psychedelic-related deaths in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, 1997 to 2022. So why don't you take us through the paper, Rebecca?
So this paper is looking at data collected on the NP-SUM database, which is the National Programme of Substance Use Mortality. And the data set they were looking at was from the 1st of July 1997 to the 1st of November 2022. So NP-SUM is basically a database, for those of you who don't know, a database that collects data related to deaths following a psychoactive drug. Different coroners areas in England, Wales and Northern Ireland report to this database. Currently they have 85% of coroners reporting. So if a psychoactive drug has been used or is related to the history of the case, then the death gets reported to NP-SUM. So they looked at drugs with serotonergic psychedelic activity with agonist action at the serotonin receptor only. So they looked at LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, 25I-N-BOMe, 25C-N-BOMe, 2CP, DOB, DOC, DOI, and then N-dimethyltryptamine. So basically they gathered all of the cases they had in this database related to these drugs and then categorised them based on whether the psychedelic in question was related to the death, whether it might be, whether the psychedelic was implicated in the death, whether it was plausibly implicated or not implicated but detected at PM, and then just pursued the ones that were implicated or plausibly implicated. In total, there were 103 cases. 75 of them were excluded off the bat because they weren't implicated in the death. So we had 28 cases to look at. 21 were those that were implicated in the death. 7 were plausibly implicated. And the number of cases increases between 2015 and 2019.
I mean, the absolute numbers year on year are relatively low, aren't they? There was a slight increase, I think probably between 2010 to 14 and 2015 to 19. But, in total, we're looking at an increase of from 6 to 8 in those 4-year windows. So really, these are very, very low numbers. I wanted to go back to the ones that were excluded. I'm not sure if they talk about this. And what was did they give any examples of why they did exclude some? So
they excluded those that weren't implicated in the death but were detected at post-mortem, or those where there's evidence of recent or historic use, but they didn't feel that it was directly related to the cause of death.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful.
So just some general stats on those 28 cases. 19 cases involved tryptamine-related psychedelics, and 9 were phenethylamine-related psychedelics.
So just let's kind of jump in there and explain the difference. And Rebecca very, very well summarised classes of psychedelics at the start of this, but they classified LSD as a tryptamine as opposed to a lysergamide. Apples and oranges, depending on how you define things. When we're talking about tryptamines in this context, we're talking about LSD, psilocybin, and DMT. And the phenethylamines are the compounds commonly referred to as hallucinogenic amphetamines. And they're the N-bome compounds, 2C compounds. Why don't you jump back in and tell us your stats?
Out of the 28 cases that they looked at, 85.7% of them were classed as accidental deaths. And in 68% of cases, multiple drugs were implicated, namely MDMA, ketamine, and alcohol were most commonly implicated drugs in this group. But MDMA, alcohol, and cannabis were the most commonly detected at PM across all of them. It's quite interesting.
I think that really is interesting in terms of, we're looking at a huge time window here. We're looking at 25 years, and in that time, the total number was relatively low, and only, 2 are down as single drug toxicity, which probably does suggest relatively low acute toxicities of these compounds. But I think what is interesting is the number of cases whereby there was some degree of misadventure or some degree of accident. Do you want to take us through some of the example cases?
So what's quite good about the NP-SOM database is they get a lot of background information related to the circumstances. So they've been able to theme different aspects of these psychedelic-related deaths. There are 9 themes that they've covered in this paper. So one of them being physical environment. So 6 of the deaths were related to height and 3 were related to water. 7 of these cases were people taking these psychedelics at parties, which is quite a common place where people do take psychedelics. Yeah, and I assume it just so happened that they weren't in necessarily the best external environment.
So in other words, the acute toxicity appears to be, in this data set, fairly low, but there are quite a few cases relatively in which accidents such as falls from height and things like that may have occurred. Yeah, so I think one emerging theme really that is quite clear is the psychological or behavioural reactions. In other words, although people may not have suffered much acute biological toxicity, there does seem to be a fair few cases in which people had sufficiently bad psychological reactions to ultimately end up in the death of the individual. There's also a lot of multi-drug use in there, isn't there?
There is. 23 out of the 28 cases, there was ingestion of 2 or more psychoactive substances. Most involved the addition of a non-prescribed recreational drug. And several of these deaths came about due to excessive use of another drug, like cocaine, for example. There was definitely one case of acute fatal cocaine toxicity where they'd also just happened to be using a psychedelic.
I'm interested a little bit in the N-bome deaths, because N-bomes were or are a class of, let's say, hallucinogenic phenethylamines, but for a while did appear in drug markets being missold as LSD. And it is probably a lot more acutely toxic than LSD. And there's a couple, isn't there? 3 N-bome deaths?
I think there were 5 N-bome deaths.
5 N-bome deaths.
But 3 of them, the user thought they were using something else, like LSD, and didn't realise how potent the drug they were taking actually was.
And that's always a risk, buying anything on the street, you never quite know what you're doing. I think there was a phase where N-bome was particularly prevalent. I haven't seen it in recent years. Doesn't mean it's not out there, of course.
Another thing they cover is mental health. So 2 individuals had pre-diagnosed mental health conditions. So one individual had ADHD, and it was hypothesized that the use of their psychedelic could increase their impulsivity, unfortunately leading to their death. There was also an individual who was diagnosed bipolar and was on fluoxetine, which is an SSRI, so a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It was also on lithium and had grand mal seizures after ingesting LSD. And it is kind of known that lithium and classical psychedelics does increase your risk of seizures.
Yeah, as you say, the interaction of psychedelics and lithium is recognised to be a risk factor for seizures. I'm not sure we entirely understand the mechanism, but it's likely to do with lithium's effect on sodium channels, I suspect. So what's the conclusion of this paper?
So basically, there are so many different factors that have led to each individual, in this case, unfortunate death. And I don't think any one of them is more important than any of the others. You've got lots of people with like physical health conditions, which obviously put them at risk of adverse effects. You've got their environment, whether they were by a body of water and things like that.
I think the other side of this, though, is that in a 25-year period, actually, there are relatively few deaths in which psychedelics are actually directly implicated. So it does compare it to what we were talking about last week when we were looking at the UK drug-related death statistics. This is a drop in the ocean compared to the number of drug-related deaths, of which are associated with drugs like heroin or cocaine. So it really does suggest that there is a real difference here between some of those drugs and psychedelics. Any further thoughts on this paper before we move on to our next? Any limitations of this data?
But it's all dependent on the coroners reporting these cases to NP-SUM. It also relates to whether they've been implicated in their cause of death or mentioned anywhere in the tox report. We could be missing cases where it's not considered important, it's not written in the circumstances of the case, things like that.
Yeah, I think that's the only sort of thought I've really had on this is actually this data covers 25 years and how many people 25 years ago routinely were testing for LSD in post-mortem samples. There is a possibility that some of these cases are underrepresented, but a lot of these cases had clear...
They had other causes.
Yeah, they had...
Like a fall from height
absolutely.
Or drowning or things like that.
And also clear history.
Yeah.
Indicating that psychedelic use may have been at least involved. So, yeah, I'm not sure how big a drawback that is.
So the next paper we're going to talk about is the national and regional trends in seizures of shrooms in the United States between 2017 and 2022.
I thought this was a really interesting little paper. Basically... You carry on.
Sorry. Basically, the take-home message seems to be that there was an increase in seizures from 2017 to 2022, and there are so many factors that could be the cause of this, either an increase in availability of mushrooms, the trend that's been happening in microdosing of shrooms.
Microdosing is this idea, taking doses that are sub the dose that would be required to generate a psychedelic experience, but may possibly have some physiological effect on the brain, on the mind, on all sorts of things. It's a really interesting area. It's an area that's undergoing significant research at the moment. As it stands, I don't think we've got solid evidence either way as to whether there's any benefits to microdosing. But it's definitely a trend that has increased over the last few years. The other thing to think about with this paper is this is US data.
This is US data. And lots of states have decriminalised the possession of shrooms, which might be a reason why like the seizures have gone up, because people are possessing it, and it's because it's decriminalised, it's kind of okay to possess. And there's also an interesting trend in that there were more seizures in the Midwest versus the West versus the South versus the Northeast, which is quite interesting, which is probably due to where it's been decriminalised. I haven't really looked into that all too much. And there have been lots of articles coming out with perceived therapeutic benefits of using mushrooms.
I think that's really key. Every time there's a big study that shows that psychedelic drugs can cause possible benefits, there is a knock-on effect in which there probably is an increase in people seeking out these compounds. I think, this is a very different market as well. The US market is very different from the UK. In the UK, mushrooms are banned under the Misuse of Drugs Act, Class A drugs. It hasn't always been the case, though.
No?
I'm old enough to remember when you could go down Camden Market and there was the mushroom cellar at the back. And if you bought unprepared mushrooms, fresh mushrooms, that was completely legal. So a very different world back then.
Different times. One big caveat with this paper is that seizures indicate availability, but not like prevalence of use. So just because there are more seizures of these doesn't mean that more people are using them.
It could just mean they're getting better at catching them, right?
Exactly.
Finding them. Yeah.
But yeah, it was quite interesting. They had 402 seizures in 2017 and 1,396 in 2022. So pretty decent increase.
I'm confused. There are states where it's decriminalised.
Yeah.
So why are they seizing it?
I don't know. Do they still just, like in drug seizures, they're going to, like if it's with a load of other things they're going to seize, are they going to seize it and record it?
Okay.
Anyway.
If anyone from the States is listening and knows the answer, do drop us a comment. We'd really appreciate that.
I do know we have one listener in the States. We'd really like to hear from you.
Anything else interesting in this paper? It was a relatively short paper. And really, my take home from this was mushroom use possibly is increasing in the US.
That was basically my take-home message too. So.
On the background of changes in drug market trends, that sounds probably quite plausible. So I want to move on now to our next paper. And back in our original paper that we talked about, there was a really interesting, it was kind of an aside really, but it talked about a couple of cases in which individuals had died following psychedelic use who had spinal cord injuries. And there was a referenced paper in that. And we ended up having a read of that one because it really did seem like quite an unusual overrepresentation within that data. I believe how many deaths were there in that first paper?
28.
28.
That they
2 had spinal cord injuries. So, 8% or so, which is probably overrepresented. And so we've kind of had a read of that paper as well. Why don't you take us through this?
So in spinal cord injury patients, there is an increased burden of mental health disorders, and quite recently psilocin and MDMA have been approved by the FDA for use in major depressive disorder and PTSD respectively. And in Australia, psilocybin has been used to treat treatment-resistant depression. But there's not a lot of guidance on therapy in these kinds of patient groups.
So let's just talk about that for a moment. So this is where now we're starting to see these studies emerge in which psychedelic drugs are used to treat treatment-resistant depression, and by that we mean depression that is resistant to standard treatments, so SSRIs typically.
But when looking at like self-reports, so on forums like Reddit, those with spinal cord injuries report intense, non-ordinary and uncomfortable leg spasms after serotonergic psychedelic use, like the use of magic mushrooms, which is interesting.
It's really interesting, isn't it? So this group of people who may well be suffering from poor mental health, probably have poor mental health overrepresented due to what's occurred to them. And the other side of this actually possibly is that there's some evidence, although it's sketchy, about serotonergics and other compounds actually leading to increased neuroplasticity. So the idea that serotonergics may possibly actually help nerve cells regrow or reconnect and establish connections. I have briefly Googled this yesterday, and I tried to look for an actual study looking at this, and I couldn't find one. But there are odd, isolated personal reports of individuals with spinal cord injuries claiming that magic mushrooms actually helped them regain some functionality. So you can see a world in which individuals may want to try using these compounds, and yet possibly there may well be some benefits, but there appears there could well be some additional risks in these patients as well. And I thought this paper was really interesting because they actually do, firstly, they looked at users on Reddit and their experiences with psychedelics in these contexts, but also they do postulate some possible hypotheses as well, don't they?
They do. So a lot of things happen post spinal cord injuries. They talk about reorganization of spinal neural networks, alterations of properties of interneurons and motor neurons. When you get a complete transection of your spinal cord, the descending 5-HT serotonin supply is lost, and the serotonin receptors undergo various degrees of expression.
So in other words, there's a reduction in serotonin exposure to these neurons. In fact, there's a complete cessation of serotonin exposure. And therefore, probably, downstream cells have some degree of upregulation of 5-HT receptors because they're not being stimulated. And then you take a drug which stimulates 5-HT receptors directly, and you get an exaggerated response in these areas that were no longer innervated. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so this leads to a really interesting pattern of muscle tremors and serotonin syndrome.
Yeah, they do mention a little bit about serotonin syndrome being a risk in these sorts of patient groups. It's also noted that patients with injuries at T6 or above are at risk of autonomic dysreflexia, where an autonomic stimulus can cause life-threatening increases in blood pressure and heart rate. And obviously psychedelic use can exacerbate that, which might be a reason why these patients are suffering quite severe adverse effects.
Yes, that's really interesting. So, yeah, possibly an increased risk in this patient group. I think one thing's quite clear, that although we're seeing this increase, particularly in the last five years or so, we've seen this increase in the number of papers come out that show real potential for psychedelic compounds to have therapeutic benefits. There's clearly still a lot we don't know. I think it's probably, I don't want to get too political, it's probably fair to say that years and years of prohibition, starting in the 1960s when LSD was developed, probably have had a negative impact on our understanding of these compounds today, because it's only really been in the last, 5-10 years or so that we've actually been able to start really seeing studies actually looking at these compounds and both trying to see their role in potential therapeutics, but also then try and understand really the pharmacology of what's going on.
And it's worrying with people thinking that these compounds are fairly safe based on the statistics of risks of adverse effects, but there's so much we don't know about, like drug-on-drug interactions and how people with other health conditions, how that can impact their risk of adverse effects. And so people are using without that knowledge backing them. And
yeah, I mean, completely fair. I wouldn't have, until I read this paper, it probably hadn't occurred to me the potential increased risk of psychedelic drugs in people's spinal cord injuries. But yeah, it does appear to be, there may well be some logic in that and some evidence to back that up. Do you have any final thoughts on psychedelics before we wrap up this episode?
I don't think so. I can't think of anything else that I think we should talk about.
No, fair enough. Well, thank you all for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. And yeah, do drop us a follow, drop us a like, drop us some comments and some feedback. We really do appreciate it.
And if any of you have got any papers that you've seen recently or recommendations of things you want us to talk about on this podcast, please send us a message over on Instagram. Try and make sure those are included.
Absolutely. Have a great week, everyone.